I grew up listening to the CBC, you know, it's just a part of my childhood. It was always on, you know, it was that voice kind of going in the background and, you know, that you could learn something from.
I'm 77 years old. I've lived with the CBC almost all my life.
I tune into the CBC daily, and to think that it might be threatened by cuts and eventually disappear one day, it's quite upsetting.
It's important to have a strong national public broadcaster because it defines who we are as a people and gives us a voice.
Represents a lot of multiculturalism.
Reflects, you know, the bones of the country, the heart of the country.
It's part of our culture, right? I mean, it's been part of Canada for so long.
Something that's wonderful about the CBC is, you know, I can call my parents in the Midwest and they've seen the same story and we can chat about that story and have that connection.
It is the only network, the only organization that brings this country together. East, west, north, south, there is nothing else.
Brilliant documentaries, unbiased reporting, which is so important now, especially now.
It's actually been an incubator of amazing local content that reflects the multiculturalism of our country.
I think it's terrible that Canada ranks at the bottom among Western democracies for its funding of its national public broadcaster.
I feel angry about the cuts and frustrated and despairing about the direction of our current federal government.
You're just crippling the CBC. And in the end, I don't know where it's going to go.
CBC is crucial, it is important, and it should be maintained, and it should be funded.
I would say that we're really losing a vital part of Canada by making these cuts to the CBC. I think it's incredibly important to safeguard our traditions and our culture.
And by stripping that away, you're really tearing at the fabric of what makes us such a special country.
Welcome to this Friends of Canadian Broadcasting online production. As a result of budget cuts, the future of our national public broadcaster, the CBC, has been very much on the public mind in recent months. And with a general election on the near horizon, the parties are sharpening their political messages. With this in mind, Friends has invited the leaders of Canada's federal political parties with representation in the House of Commons to provide Canadians with their vision of CBC's future. Next in our series is Justin Trudeau, leader of the Liberal Party. I am very pleased to introduce the great Don Newman, who will host this session and interview Mr. Trudeau. Over to you, Don.
Thanks, Ian, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Webcast, the third and the last in the Leaders series. And thank you for joining us, Mr. Trudeau. I appreciate it. I know how busy you are as we get ready for a budget and an election campaign, and it's very good of you to take the time.
It's a real pleasure to be here, Don.
Now, we've had viewers sending in questions that they'd like to hear your answers to about the future of the poor, beleaguered, and battered CBC, if I may put it that way, a little editorial comment. And the first question comes from Montreal, and the questioner writes, Prime Minister Harper said recently that Radio-Canada journalists were leftists who hated conservative views and policies. And the letter continues, the Conservatives frequently use anti-CBC comments for fundraising appeals, which I think we all know. And then he asks, do you think that the CBC and Radio-Canada have a bias against the Conservatives? Or, he writes, could it be the other way around and the Conservatives have a bias against the CBC?
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen from this government all too often is a blending of the interests of the government of Canada with the interests of the Conservative Party of Canada. And they've figured out that they have a narrow base that they can activate in terms of fundraising by attacking the CBC, by still claiming after 10 years in government that everyone's still out to get them. And it's that mentality that gets them a certain amount of satisfaction and traction. So when the Prime Minister goes off on such an attack, which is quite unseemly for a Prime Minister in a modern democracy to do, I think we all get a little bit worried. I mean, it's not to say that there aren't situations that have happened in the past and will certainly happen in the future where a government or a Prime Minister gets frustrated at a particular piece of reporting, and I can guarantee you if I end up forming government in the future, I will certainly have moments of deep frustration with the media for saying this or that, but that's natural in a solid, comfortable, modern democracy. There needs to be a place to speak truth to power. But to go off on these kinds of petty, almost personal, vindictive attacks is something that's really not seemly for a prime minister to do. And certainly when you match that with the cuts that have been brought in on a purely ideological basis, you really see that this government is quashing anyone, whether it be the CBC or officers of parliament or third-party scientists or whoever have you, that is critical towards them. They simply attack. And that's not the way we should have a democratically functioning government.
Well, do you think the cuts maybe are I mean, Mr. Harper obviously believes what he said. Do you think that then he's cutting this, the CBC and Radio Canada because he thinks they're leftists and have anti-conservative views?
I think Mr. Harper has a hard time with anyone who disagrees with him, and he takes it personally. And that's something that, to my mind, shouldn't be how a modern democracy functions. I mean, one of the things we have to understand is, in the 21st century, with citizens being more engaged, more informed than ever before, they need to have better and unbiased information from all perspectives on how their government is doing, so that they can hold it to account, and quite frankly, so government makes sure that it's doing the absolute best it can to actually serve the interests of the public. And this is a really important piece of how to function in a modern democracy. And the fact that right now the CBC is in a precarious situation where there's political interference at the board level, there's a government that attacks it, there's backbenchers who get up all the time to try and score cheap points off of our public broadcaster, you can understand that this is something that is really uneasy, particularly when you look at the mandate of CBC. I mean, CBC's mandate is to bind the country together by informing citizens, making them empowered agents of activity, of change in their communities, highlight local stories, and do so in both official languages to make sure that we remember right across this country that those things that bind us together are much more powerful than all those differences and divisions that exist across the country. And when you weaken the CBC, you actually weaken the fabric of this country's identity.
Well, let's go on to our next question. It comes from Bancroft, Ontario, and it goes like this. CBC funding has been dramatically cut in recent years. What cuts would you undo? In other words, what cuts would you reestablish to the CBC budget?
Well, first of all, we've seen most recently cuts of $115 million a year to the budget, and that's had a direct impact on everything from the costume shop at Radio Canada to local newscasts across the country. And one of the things that we have engaged ourselves as a party is if we form government, we will reverse those cuts. But more than that, we need to talk about where CBC needs to go to continue to be able to fulfill its mandate in the best possible way in a rapidly changing world and media environment. How do we make better use of the innovations around webcasts and the various new realities of how people consume media online? What do we do, and do we need more funding on top of that? How do we actually give CBC the capacity to do what it continues to do well, which is tell our stories, but also make sure that those stories are being told by some of the brightest, most creative, in many cases, young people coming up either as journalists or as creative artists or as producers and filmmakers. These kinds of things is what CBC has always given a baseline for, to bring on the innovators and be at that cutting edge in how we share our stories. And the fact that right now we're squeezing out the CBC is so counterproductive, because CBC is stuck in a short-term survival mode right now, when it should be continually thinking what is in the long-term best interests of how we serve Canadians.
But when you think about, they say they're going to balance the budget, but they basically are doing it by selling the stock that they had in General Motors. So we're actually really right around a deficit again. And it looks as though, unless the price of oil suddenly shoots back up again, which nobody seems to think it will, we're going to probably be right around a deficit for some time. So reestablishing funding for the CBC, is it possible in that kind of economic situation? I think when we thought, oh, well, you know, we're into surpluses and we can give some to the CBC, but we're not going to be in surpluses.
I'm reminded of a story about Winston Churchill in the Second World War, when he was offered a list of the very many cuts that they had to make in terms of their ministries to be able to finance the war effort. And when it came to the Ministry of Culture, people said, oh, we can cut a lot from there. And Churchill said, no, we don't cut anything from culture, because if not, what are we fighting for? And it comes down to one of the core things about this country is we are a country that is strong not in spite of our differences, but because of those differences. And the way we celebrate those differences is by understanding each other better. It's sharing our local stories, but also sharing those national stories. And the CBC is at the heart of how we do that and how we shape Canadian identity in an ongoing way. But the other piece of why CBC is so important is it's a great example of how we hold our decision makers to account. A strong, independent, free press is essential to make sure that democracies function properly. And when we're in times of making difficult decisions, to cut from the people who are supposed to be that check and balance, who are supposed to be informing people about the decisions that are being made, the choices that a government makes, is really self-serving from a government point of view, but not in the interest of the country. We need to be investing in things that are going to continue to keep us on the right path, keep us growing, keep us celebrating our strengths. And that means giving CBC the tools it needs to do its job.
Well, do you think then maybe a funding model like the British have for the BBC, where you have to buy a license when you have a TV, that does guarantee the funding and it does provide the money, and it sort of takes it out of the day-to-day political management of the budget and whatever else the government has to deal with. Do you think that there's any merit in that, or do you think that that may work in Britain but it wouldn't work here?
I'm totally open to looking at various models, and I think the further we can remove the funding for an institution like the CBC from day-to-day political angst or decisions, the better we'll be as a country. Now, there's a lot of different funding models out there. We have to really think about also not just what has worked in the past and elsewhere, but what's going to work in here. And towards the future, as people, won't really watch TV as much on their TVs anymore. There are shifts that we have to take into account. But the bottom line for me is we need to make sure that CBC has strong, stable, predictable, long-term funding that is sufficient for it to fulfill its mandate moving forward of empowering and informing Canadians and celebrating the extraordinariness of this country.
Well, here's another question that has come in, and I must say that it resonates with me, having worked there for 33 years, but it says, the President and the Board of the CBC have been silent on the recent spending cuts and other attacks on the corporation. And when you look at who they are, the Board and the President, well, they're almost all not only Conservative supporters, but they actually gave money to the Conservative Party. So this person in Winnipeg wants to know, how would you make sure that the governance of the CBC is nonpartisan? Can you make sure that it is?
I think yes. I think we need to. I think this is a great example, but there's been a long history of that. But for me, that we be seeing the kinds of unnecessary cuts that are brought forward right now just because the government of the day has a bone to pick with the CBC, as the Prime Minister said very clearly, that the board isn't speaking out against these cuts, that they're sort of accepting of it, well, it really reinforces that 9 out of 11 board members were Conservative Party donors, which for me is unacceptable. And I think as we move forward, we have to understand that what may have been acceptable in the past no longer passes the smell test today. And we have to make sure that the board appointees of the CBC are picked in a nonpartisan, transparent, open way by people people who have the interests of the CBC and Radio-Canada and the interests of the Canadian public top of mind, not the narrow partisan interests of one political party or another, whether or not that party happens to be in government. That's actually what I've proposed on the Senate as well. I mean, we're seeing the Senate splashed across the news right now. The fact is, we removed political partisanship and patronage from the Senate by taking senators out of our caucus and saying that any appointments will be done at an arm's length process off a list that is generated based on people who are qualified in an open and transparent way to serve their country. We could do that not just for the Senate, but for the board of the CBC and a number of other institutions where patronage appointments simply cannot continue, not from a government that wants to be responsible.
Would you consider making the, you might make the term a little longer, making the president only capable of serving one term? And I say this because the current president has been reappointed. It's very rare that a president of the CBC gets reappointed. A couple have been extended, but this president hasn't said a word against any cut that has happened on his watch, and the cuts have been brutal on his. I mean, they've been difficult on some other watches too, but he hasn't said a word, and he got reappointed. And it seems to me that his job seems to be the most secure one at the CBC right now.
Yeah, and perhaps the only one. That challenge is something that highlights one of the real challenges that people put to me regularly these days. You know, they look at the way this government is behaving and they say, oh, well, you got to bring in a law to prevent them from ever doing this again, or change the structure so this never happens again. And I sort of say, okay, wait a minute. I mean, we have an exceptional situation right now of a government that are really being fairly destructive about a lot of things that a lot of people value. And trying to create laws that are constraining this government might not be perfectly applicable to a more reasonable situation. You know, whether we had progressive conservatives or liberal governments in the past, this never seemed to be much of a problem. So I don't want to create too many exceptional laws because of this guy here, but I do agree that these are the kinds of things that we need to discuss and think about so we make sure that this doesn't happen in the future. And I think basically taking as a standpoint that the CBC needs to be further arm's length, more independent in its governance, less dependent on political decisions for its continued and day-to-day functioning, is a principle that can be done many different ways, and I really want to make sure we're doing it the right way. Maybe that means a longer term but not reappointable. Maybe there's other mechanisms, and that's the kind of the reflection that I think the CBC should be deeply involved in, to say, okay, how could we make this better going forward? I worry about government making too many decisions in terms of that.
Here's a question from Victoria, BC. Would a Liberal government refine the mandate of the CBC so that there would be less popular programming, and more concentration on the arts and local programming, and less national programming? And that's sort of an interesting question, because if you have less popular programming, you probably have less people watching it, which may or may not be a good thing, I suppose.
But that goes to the mandate of CBC. Yeah. Does it need to compete with the private broadcasters, and therefore does it fall into needing to draw eyeballs to generate ad revenue to be able to function, or do we have a different model? And I appreciate the question being asked of me, but I don't know that that's a question that it should be up to the Prime Minister or an eventual Prime Minister to decide. I mean, this is a conversation for Canadians. What do we want the CBC to be? Now, for me, the mandate of the CBC is to inform and value Canadians and Canadians' culture and Canadian news, and share our stories right across the country so that we both understand how important our particular area or region or town is, but also how it fits into the whole. And where that balance lines up will naturally evolve and shift over various time cycles. What's important for me is that we keep in mind the overall mandate and we adjust to the shifting reality. I mean, the reality is choice. People are going to be able to choose to watch whatever they like, and do so on any number of different media. And how we make sure that CBC is doing the best possible job of promoting Canadian identity in all its broad spectrums, to do so in both official languages or our official language minorities in various parts of the country can continue to feel connected to their cultures. These are the kinds of things that we have to really dig into. But there's no easy, simple answers. No, it's not going to be all symphonies all the time on one side, because we have an extraordinary diverse population that loves different things. But one of the things that CBC's done really, really well, for example, is made a conscious decision over the past few years to focus on Canadian-generated musical content, really to celebrate Canadian artists. And if we have world-class Canadian music doing great around the world, it's in large part because the CBC made a very real and concrete decision to start celebrating that, and it had a tremendous impact on how we view ourselves and how we celebrate our great culture. And that kind of flexibility written into a strong mandate, I think, remains important for the CBC.
Do you think that we need if not a royal commission, some kind of commission of inquiry into what the mandate should be? Or do you think that, I mean, we are living in such a fluid and quickly changing time that I'm not sure that any commission, by the time it had been appointed, it might be out of date already. And you see now the chairman of the CRTC saying, well, on private broadcasting, we don't need as much Canadian content, we need better Canadian content, which seems to me then for the CBC, which has the mandate for Canadian content, to do even more.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're seeing is the media universe is changing extremely rapidly. And, just the idea of yet another royal commission for a few years to get around. I think there's an awful lot of people who've thought very long and hard about what the CBC could and should be. And I think there's a way to pull those people together and showcase to Canadians what we want. I mean, I spent the past years talking with Canadians all across this country. And one of the things that keeps coming back is a desire to be engaged and empowered in active citizenship, whether it's contributing in your community directly or feeling part of a national vision or a national challenge that we're taking on once again of being this extraordinary country. And the CBC will always be an important tool, an important means of drawing Canadians together and helping us dream big about the future. So how that actually articulates concretely will probably change regularly, but that's not up to a government to decide with its thumb on the scales. It's up to Canadians to contribute and to shape their CBC with their hopes and dreams.
Well, here's a question from North Saanich, BC, which in a way captures a bit of the dilemma of not just, I guess, for broadcasters, but for a lot of society at the moment. And it says, the CBC has been moving to more digital programming on more platforms in an effort to attract a younger audience. But longtime listeners and viewers, according to the questioner, are worried that they are actually losing access to free programs over the air on TV that they rely on, and on radio too. Is there anything, Mr. Trudeau, that can be done about that, or is this just a generational change that the technology changes and some people, younger people, are early adapters and older people are either late adapters or don't adapt at all?
Well, I think this is only a problem because of the funding squeeze that CBC is going through right now. I mean, we should be able to be innovative and reaching out to newer methods and newer techniques to draw in new viewers, while at the same time continuing to provide the kind of service that people have turned to CBC to for decades. And the fact that it's now becoming an either-or is really worrisome for me, because it shouldn't be an either-or. We should be drawing on the strength and the fidelity the loyalty that so many people have had towards the CBC for so many years, and contribute and continue to offer them the programming that they want and that they have access to, while at the same time reaching out to innovative ways of adding to that, of bringing in new generations of viewers and listeners. And that's what a public broadcaster should be doing. The fact that, again, they're in short-term survival mode at the CBC right now is preventing that long-term reflection about how we continue to offer the best possible to all Canadians everywhere and of every age. I mean, that's a big mandate, but that's what the CBC is supposed to be doing.
Well, let me ask you this, and I don't do it to be argumentative, and you weren't there at the time, but realistically, Liberal governments have cut CBC budgets in the past, and particularly in the 90s. In fact, it could be we go back to Lester Pearson before we find a Prime Minister who really appreciated the role of the CBC in Canadian democracy and culture. in the deficit fight during the 1990s, the Liberals cut the CBC along with everything else. And a lot of people at the CBC thought that was unfair. I tended to think, well, if you're going to cut healthcare, you're probably going to cut the CBC, but it'll all turn out all right in the end. But it didn't, because when the deficit was eliminated, everybody else got their funding restored, and the CBC didn't. And I guess this is a question now that that was my long preamble to a question that came in and said, since the Liberals have treated the CBC with budget cuts in the past, when they were in power, why should we believe that the treatment would be any different this time?
Well, as you said, the budget cuts of the past were in a very difficult situation where Canada had to make some really, really tough choices and cut all sorts of services to Canadians in a way that that really the government at the time, and we can look back and agree, had no choice but to make significant cuts. The difference is this current government...
But my point is that when the budget went into surplus, everybody else, including defense...
They restored significant amounts of funding. They didn't restore the full funding.
Well, no, they
but there are other places that didn't get full funding restored either.
But the CBC never got it restored to the bottom line. It got for a while $60 million a year, which sounds like a lot of money, although the cut was over much larger than that. And it was restored annually, and so we never knew whether we were going to have it or not. So I'm saying that it was different than the others.
And I'm not going to spend
and
too
I'm saying
much
you weren't
time
there
trying
either,
to
no.
exactly defend the decisions made in the past. But one thing that was very clear is the government at the time made the decisions that they felt they had to do. And what we're seeing right now is a government that is cutting the CBC because it wants to. It likes doing this. It doesn't like the CBC, and it is unabashed in telling people that it doesn't like the CBC and fundraising on the back of the CBC so that they can continue to govern and continue to cut the CBC. And that's very different from choices that were made in the past. But, you know, as I do in any time people try to bring up things that the Liberal Party did in the past, I highlight that, yes, the Liberal Party made mistakes in the past, and we paid dearly for it. And that's why we're in a distant third place position in the House of Commons. And that's why I'm so serious about working hard to fix the errors of the past, which was to turn inwards too much as a party and be reconnected with Canadians' values and priorities. And one of the things that I hear right across the country is how important it is for us that we have access to strong information that speaks truth to power, a properly funded CBC that puts out the investigative journalism, the strong news that holds our governments to account, yes, including my government, if I earn the trust of Canadians, in a way that actually enhances our democracy, that allows us to make better choices and improves the outcome for Canadians, while at the same time celebrating our culture and our identity. These are things that the CBC is essential for, and it's something that I believe in deeply. And I'm not going to spend too much time trying to either distance myself or apologize for decisions of the past, because I'm very much focused on the future. I'll let the people who were there discuss what happened back then. I'm going to talk about what we need to do now, what we need to do going forward. And I know that the Canada that we need to build needs a strong and independent CBC.
So we have the economy, we have ISIS and national security, we have the income gap and the vanishing middle class. These are all going to be election issues. Do you think that, and we're getting short on time, but do you think that the CBC will become an election issue, or do you think that these other things will really crowd it out and we'll really have to trust the good faith of the party leaders on what they're going to do about the CBC?
I think the election is going to come down to two things. Mostly the economy. People vote with their pocketbooks, their jobs, their kids' futures, their own retirement. That's what people are worried about, and that's what the election is going to play on. But folded into that, we're going to have elements of the kind of government we have, how the tone, the approach, and a big piece of that is how it makes decisions based on evidence, how it puts forward policies that are in the best interests of Canadians, and a strong, independent media, private broadcasters doing their part, but a strong public broadcaster able to hold people to account, able to make sure that Canadians are properly informed about what people in power are doing, is an essential part of how we make sure that we're on the right path going forward. And Canadians are worried about that.
Well, as I said at the beginning, I know how busy you are, so I really do appreciate you taking the time now to talk about the CBC. And thank you for being here tonight.
No, it's a real pleasure, and for me, be able to get worked up about the CBC is something that I love to do.
And that's all the time we have, unfortunately, this evening. But thank you very much for joining us. And if you want to see all of them, of course, why wouldn't you want to see all of our series on the CBC? Then what you have to do is go to www.friends.ca, and there you'll see both this interview, but also the other interviews as well. And I hope you'll do that, and I hope you'll get involved. I'm Don Newman. So long for now.